Hello everyone and welcome to this talk on poppies and other cornfield weeds with Dr. Andrew Lack, who's based down in Oxford, I think. Is that right, Andrew? And
Yes.
a few sunshine down there?
Yes, indeed. It's quite pleasant for February. It's quite pleasant.
We've got, I'm just asking because we've got an absolutely classic northeast winter day here today while we're recording this with lashing wind and rain coming in off the North Sea. So I know you've got some experience of that. I think you studied your undergraduate degree up in Aberdeen, so you're maybe familiar with that weather.
I'm certainly yes, familiar with that northeast part of Scotland, yes.
So I'll just say a little bit about myself and Eric, and then we'll hand over to you, Andrew. So this talk sort of is following on from our autumn conference, which we ran in September with the Tees Valley Wildlife Trust, with a series of talks. So we just thought it'd be nice to continue having some online content and talks which might feature local wildlife or national wildlife, or who knows, possibly international. So I'm Fiona Greenwald. I'm the engagement officer for ERIC Northeast, which is the Environmental Records Information Centre Northeast. We are part of local environmental record centres, which are organisations that collect together the local wildlife records. So if you spot anything, do send it in to us. And we've got the talk today. So Andrew, you are a biologist, sort of specialising in botany, and I'll just maybe ask you to, I'm just checking I've said everything I need to say, and I'll just hand over to you, Andrew, if you could just introduce yourself, and I'll switch my screen off and mute myself and your screen sharing, and we'll have your talk. So if you could just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yes, hello and thank you, Fiona. My name's Andrew Lack, and yes, I am in Oxford. I've been lecturing at Oxford Brookes for many years now, and plants has been my main subject. I've been particularly interested in the pollination of plants, but also more recently just in many aspects of botany, and I've looked at something of the history of the poppy too, and then which inevitably means expanding to some of the other cornfield weeds, which is what I thought I would talk about this evening. And I wanted to talk about poppies and cornfield weed and other cornfield weeds, because poppy is perhaps the best known of all the cornfield weeds, because they have very particular problems and particular interest. I mean, a particular interest for me as well, partly because of some of their origins, which I'll come on to, and because in many ways, these are the plants of the countryside that I grew up with in the 1960s. And we do have quite a lot of declines in cornfield weeds, some of which have been really very serious declines. And so, we really have to try and think of those. And I think it becomes quite a serious conservation problem. Poppies are perhaps the one that I've studied most. And if I try and get the, there, right. Now, hopefully you can see a beautiful field of poppies. And poppies, I love poppies. Poppies, it's one of the only plants, isn't it, that you can actually identify from a mile away. Can you identify any other plant with such certainty from a mile away? Probably not. Poppies, you really can. And you can do this for two reasons. Firstly, because they do form these wonderful, great big swathes across fields when just occasionally, and only occasionally now, they are actually allowed to do this. And okay, for the most part, farmers have tried to stop this for obvious reasons. They take away from the crop. And you don't want, when you're harvesting your crop, just to harvest poppies, because that's obviously just not what you're after. But when they do this, it forms, and this is pictures taken in Wiltshire by a friend, And he found this wonderful field of poppies, and the poppy is so distinctive, partly because of its extraordinary distinctive color. And I think it's very interesting that it's this wonderful scarlet color, which is almost unique in the entire British flora. We don't have red flowers like the poppy, or at least only one or two others, which I will mention. This is partly because the insects that do the pollinating in this country actually are not sensitive to the red end of the spectrum that we are. They are sensitive to a bit of the ultraviolet, but they're not sensitive to the red end. And that immediately sort of raises interesting points about the poppy. But the poppy actually is quite extraordinary, because just as an aside, really, that the poppy actually reflects the light in two different places. It reflects on the red end of the spectrum, which is what you and I see. It also reflects in the near ultraviolet. And although we can't see it, or at least we possibly could just a little bit of it if, not the ultraviolet, but just extending into the visual violet, if the red wasn't there. But that's what the bee sees. And so the bees will visit it, seeing a rather different colored plant from what we do. But having said that, this is the corn poppy. This is the common poppy. And luckily, it is still very common, although a site like this one is quite rare these days. Yes, I have seen the occasional poppy field, but normally we see poppies. It's not a rare plant. It's in field edges and trackways and sort of edges of gardens and land which has perhaps been abandoned for some reason, rough land. And yes, you still get poppies in those places, but covering fields like this, it's really quite a rare sight. And a magnificent one to us. We're not trying to harvest the land, are we? A magnificent one to us. And of course, it's a magnificent one to many painters as well. Monet, founder of French Impressionism, he painted poppies. Perhaps this is his best known picture of poppies. But he painted poppies many times. He tended to have a whole series of paintings on a number of things, perhaps most famously the water lilies, but the poppies featured largely in Monet's output. And even if he didn't refer to them as poppies, although he did in this one, almost every picture of agricultural land had a field of red in it, or some part which was red in it. And that red always signified poppies to Monet. They were a very important plant to this mention. And incidentally, he always called them les coquelicots, which means the coxcombs, and because of the red color. But it's interesting because there is another perfectly good French word for a poppy, les pavots, but he popularized the idea of calling them les coquelicots. That was what Monet always called them. So the poppy then, one of our, possibly the most classic of all our cornfield weeds, and yes, still one of the commonest. Short-lived, it grows and it flowers and it dies within a year, except for its seeds, which can live a long time. And nearly all the plants I'm going to talk about are indeed that short-lived. They grow and flower. They're known as annuals, which of course is rather a silly name really, because annual implies that it actually lives for a year, which almost none of them does. In fact, probably none of them. Most of them live something between 3 and about 8 months. They can sometimes, some of them germinate in the autumn, flower in the summer and then die. Some of them even germinate in the spring and flower perhaps slightly later in the summer, and then will be dead by the end of the summer, again, just producing the seeds. But the seeds can live sometimes for decades. Most poppy seeds will die within 10 years, but since they produce so many of them, poppy seeds are small. You'll know that even if you look at the culinary poppy seeds, which are actually quite a bit bigger than the seeds of the poppy itself, of the corn poppy that is, because the culinary ones are seeds of the opium poppy, just by the way, but don't worry, they don't have any opium in them, or at least such negligible quantities it doesn't count. But the number of seeds that can be produced by poppies is enormous. So even if after 20 years, there's only maybe 1/100th of the seeds are still viable, possibly even less than that, that can still completely cover the field if they're given the chance actually to grow. So we have this remarkable plant. And of course, as a plant, It's pretty widespread. Here's a distribution map from the online atlas from the Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland, the BSBI. I'll show you one or two other maps as we go through. And you can see it's pretty widespread across England, Wales, and the lowland parts of Scotland and Ireland. It doesn't like the Highlands, as you can see very clearly there, but it's pretty widespread, and including right up as far north as the Moray Firth and the Black Isle, and even just a bit further north. And in these places, so as a plant, you can see it has declined in a few places. There are a few pink dots there. All the ones that aren't blue are the ones where it has been recorded but has now disappeared. Some somewhat slightly odd ones in sort of Kent or only around the Midlands, but fundamentally it's still there. But of course, that doesn't tell you how many there are. It doesn't tell you that how far it's declined. It's declined hugely. It's just that they're still present. And these dots simply mean that somebody found one somewhere in that 10-kilometre square. And again, that of course applies across with all these maps. But the poppy has become the symbol of remembrance and of war. Interestingly there, you'll notice it's got 2 petals, the standard poppy that we wear. Poppies have 4 petals. If I just nip back to that picture there, you can see rather clearly it's got 4 petals. Slightly unusually 4 petals for a flower, but they're 2 and 2. Do you see how they're there are two outer ones and then 2 inner ones. So in a way, they sort of half got it right. In Scotland, the poppies that people wear have got 4 petals and actually are much more botanically accurate. That's just as an aside. The symbol that it became as a war symbol, it became because it's such a common plant, and because it came up in the land which had been devastated by the First World War. Stimulated, very interestingly, by a poem by a Canadian, the championing of it by an American, and nearly all the poppies were actually made by the French war widows. Just interestingly, something we think of as being particularly British. All the origins were from Canada, America, or France, but that's an interesting point. But the fact is that it was an extremely common sight in all the devastated fields from the trenches and nearby from the First World War. And the colour really helped because, of course, this felt like the blood of the soldiers coming up. It was a very, very common plant. It was also familiar to everybody. If you and I can perhaps identify it from a mile away, it's a plant that almost everybody knows. Almost everybody can recognise a poppy. But some people haven't realised, of course, that there isn't the only species of poppy that we have. This is a very similar but different one. This is the long-headed poppy. Another quite common plant, but although it never, as far as I know, ever covers a cornfield in a way that the common poppy or corn poppy does. You can see clearly why it's called the long-headed poppy. That seed head there, instead of being almost spherical like the corn poppy, is much longer and thinner. The colour also is slightly different. It's a slightly paler red. But having said that, the corn poppy does vary a bit in colour, so perhaps it can be easily overlooked. It's very similar to the common poppy. There are a couple of others, much rarer ones, which do look a little bit different. One much paler and one actually quite considerably darker or more crimsony colour. But we won't be necessarily considering those. But they are all cornfield weeds. And I just thought I'd mention while I'm thinking of poppies, here's one that's become something of a cornfield weed. In fact, I found this particular one on the edge of a cornfield. This one is another very well-known plant. I shan't say much more about it. This is the opium poppy. And the opium poppy, normally this colour, although it actually can have it has a red form as well, and perhaps showing us something about nearer what the bee sees of a corn poppy, because it has much more the violet colour to it. The opium itself comes from the unripe seed heads, which you can see there to the left of the flower, scraped and the opium oozes out. I suppose I better just say, don't try this at home. But anyway, so opium, and recently actually opium has been actually grown under license in 1 or 2 farms for medical use, because of course it provides morphine and other useful drugs, particularly, but morphine mainly. But this begs the question, and it begs the question about every cornfield weed. Where were they before there were cornfields? Because the poppy is almost entirely confined to, well, it's either confined to cornfields or other sort of rough edges and derelict places and that sort of thing. It isn't known anywhere else in Britain. And then it isn't known anywhere else across Europe. So where on earth does it come from? Because agriculture only came to Britain about 7,000 years ago. Before that, there wasn't any. So presumably there weren't any poppies or indeed any other cornfield weeds. Well, if we start looking to where the corn poppy's nearest relatives are, we have to go over to the Eastern Mediterranean, because that's actually where its relatives are. And there are one or two species there. Now, in the Mediterranean, as many of you know, the summer gets so dry that very many plants die, many of the short-lived plants die, and they leave some quite sort of dusty, open patches all over the place. And we find the nearest relatives to the corn poppy are native to actually Israel, Syria, Lebanon, that area there. Those areas appear to be the cradle of the corn poppy. This is a picture taken in Israel, not by me, of one of the corn poppy's closest relatives, which is, I don't think it really has an English name, it's simply Papaver umbonatum, Papaver being the genus name of all the poppies. Papaver umbonatum, which is a close relative and in fact has shown to be interfertile with the corn poppy. There's a couple of others all looking very, very similar. The interesting thing is, though, that the corn poppy, even in that region of the Middle East, is only known in agricultural land. It looks as if the corn poppy, in fact, only appeared once agriculture started, a bit earlier down in that southeastern Mediterranean and then across into Mesopotamia. But it looks as if it still now, even there, only occurs in agricultural land. It looks as if the species only appeared then, possibly as a result of hybridization between one or two of its close relatives, such as this one, but then spread across Europe with the advent of agriculture as it spread northwards and westwards. Other species were also associated with this broken land, this rough land, and then into agricultural land. But of course, it's only a few tough ones that actually managed to make it to the very different climate that we have here. And the really rather different season, because the growing season in the Mediterranean is the winter. The growing season with us is very much the spring and early summer. So it's a very different timing that these things have to go for. But that seems to be where the corn poppy came from. It came with agriculture, so it's an ancient introduction, and this is again familiar to us from the other cornfield weeds as well. It's known as an archaeophyte, this rather lovely term, archaeophyte, an ancient plant. Ancient introduction by us, yes, but came with the advent of agriculture, and that is where so many of our weeds actually come from. So moving on, yes, okay, there's a few nice poppies in the foreground there. I came across this wonderful field of another cornfield weed, another one of our treasured cornfield weeds. This one actually in France, I have to say, although I have seen them like this in Britain, but only from my childhood, really. My 1960s childhood, I remember seeing a field of these wonderful things, which I'm sure many of you have already identified. These are cornflowers, the blue ones. And I remember seeing a field covered with them, actually up quite close to Inverness, towards the Moray Firth, right up in northern Scotland. It's the only time I've seen it in Britain, but to see this as a small field in France about 10 years ago was a very wonderful experience, just to see them like this again, and seeing a field covered with it. And it's particularly significant because in France, because the French call them, in French it is les bleus, means the bluets, and it's a name that they also gave to their soldiers in the First World War, because the soldiers wore this blue, what they called horizon blue costume. This is an old picture of French First World War soldiers, and they were known as les bleus too. And interestingly, although it doesn't have the connotations of blood like the poppy does, the French have actually used the cornflower as their remembrance symbol. Another cornfield weed, another weed that came up in the trenches and, and the surrounding, that's what, after all the devastation of the First World War. So they use this as their symbol. And it came up in quantity as well. It does seem to be much commoner in France than it is with us, but we still have them, again, usually just along the edges of places. There is a map of our cornflowers. Yes, it looks fairly extensive, but you can see an awful lot more pink or yellow dots, or green dots, if you can make out the green ones. I know they're a bit faint on this. Again, from the VSBI Atlas, online atlas. And you can see a nice patch of blues up in the northeast of England, which is all very nice. Hopefully, again, many of you will be familiar with this wonderful plant, beautiful plant, and particularly, just like the poppy, it's really beautiful in quantity, and that's where one sees it its best. And remember, each one of these dots simply means just one plant. It's all that's necessary for a blue dot to be there. So now let's move on to one or two other cornfield weeds, and I'm wondering which of these will be familiar to you, because I've chosen a few cornfield weeds out of quite a number that I could have chosen, but a few that may be familiar or may not to some of you. And I think it's sort of interesting just to sort of try and test yourself and see whether these are familiar to you. So I thought with this one, which used to be really quite a familiar cornfield weed. And as you can see, it's a very attractive plant. It stands up up to 1 meter high, usually a bit less than that, with this attractive flower. And you can see very characteristically those prominent long sepals sticking beyond the end of the petals. This, as many of you hopefully will have realized by now, is the corn cockle. And the corn cockle, called that because its seeds look like tiny black cockle shells. And they are very attractive little seeds, but they are tiny, but they're also black. This is a plant that nobody liked in their cornfield, because if the seeds of the corn cockle got into your wheat crop, or when you were going to try and make bread, then it would turn the bread a sort of unhealthy looking grey colour. But also, it's not very, but it is very mildly poisonous as well. So you really don't want corn cockles in your bread. And so the corn cockle was a plant that was particularly hated. I mean, all these cornfield weeds are hated by farmers because, after all, a farmer is trying to grow a crop. He's trying to grow the food for us, and he doesn't want that sort of competition. So the corn cockle was particularly disliked because, say, getting into the crop was a particular disaster. And it was being persecuted and people trying to eliminate it, like they were every other weed. And this sort of gathered force with the big changes to sort of somewhat mechanized agriculture back at the end of the 18th century. And then right the way through the 19th and early 20th, people were persecuting these plants, if persecute's the right word, but you can know what I mean. They're trying to eliminate these plants. And the corn cockle, and it got really quite unusual. And then in post-war agriculture, while when we became not just mechanized, but of course it became industrial and sort of chemicalized, then the corn cockle actually pretty well disappeared. And it's even thought that it might have gone completely extinct at some point. And, it's one of those classic things with so many, just be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. And with the corn cockle, that's what happened. But people liked it. And I say you might just get it. And then people think, oh, wait a minute, that was really rather a pretty plant. I liked having it around just because it's a nice thing to see. And it was familiar to people. Now, the corn cockle has been reintroduced. And you can see there, these are almost entirely reintroductions of corn cockle, if not entirely reintroductions. You can see it has been reintroduced all over the place. It's sometimes given in seed mixes for your garden, because it is a pretty plant. And you can see there, again, you can see lots of pink and yellow dots where it has disappeared, but also, thankfully, quite a lot of blue ones still where it does occur, and perhaps occur again. Here's another one. This one, again, hopefully quite a familiar one, still a fairly common plant, this one. It occurs in gardens quite a bit. It particularly likes the lime-rich, the calcareous soils, but it occurs all over the place, quite small plant. And I've already mentioned that the poppy is one of the only red plants that we've got. I'm going to show you the only other two, actually, because they are both, like the poppy, cornfield weeds. This one, immortalized by Baroness Orczy too, just a little over 100 years ago in her books, because it became the emblem of her hero within the French Revolution. This is the Scarlet Pimpernel. And the Scarlet Pimpernel, sometimes known as the poor man's weatherglass, because it closes its flowers up when in bad weather. Probably noticed it was bad weather at the same time anyway, but never mind. Scarlet Pimpernel, again, another little plant. This one, the red flower, again, this time doesn't have any ultraviolet reflectance at all, but it's almost entirely self-fertilized anyway. So the Scarlet Pimpernel, very small flower, but a very pretty one. And again, turning up all over gardens. And again, it's a plant which seems to have come from much further south and east. And these red flowered plants, beetles are the one group of insects which can see the red flowers. And some of these plants down in the extreme southeast of the Mediterranean, they've got quite a number of beetles, and they do come to pollinate these things. So we get our red flowers in a way on the back of beetle pollination over in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's really why we have any red flowers at all. I mean, I know you're going to say that there are a few plants which are called red, like the sort of red Bartsia or the red hellebrine or the red campion, but they're not red at all, are they? They're sort of purplish pink. They're not red like a poppy or a Scarlet Pimpernel. And here's the final one, a much rarer plant, and this time, again, a rather occasional cornfield weed. I don't know whether that's going to be familiar to you. It's the pheasant's eye, and rather a good name, actually. If you look carefully at the eye of a pheasant, it does look remarkably like that. But this one, quite a rare cornfield weed, which has again declined really quite considerably during the last sort of 200 odd years. And another plant coming from the southeast, and I say the only other red one, slightly darker red, but still red. Okay, to move on to a few others. Here, a field, ignore the purplish one. It's actually a field of Gladiolus bulbs, which I came across in the Isles of Scilly some years ago. And there are, Gladiolus originally was deliberately planted as famously the Scillies are great for bulb fields. But the yellow plant in amongst it is another cornfield weed, which actually I remember well from my childhood. I could see across another garden, there was farmland from when I was brought up, and I could see this plant, and it's another plant you can identify from at least somewhere away. This one, the Corn Marigold. And the Corn Marigold, as you can see, a big showy yellow daisy occurring in cornfields and occasionally on mass. That's the first time I've seen it, and that's the one and only time I've ever seen it in quite such mass as that, was this time on the Isles of Scilly. But I've seen it in various places, but not recently. I don't know whether you've ever seen much of a Corn Marigold recently, but I certainly haven't on the cornfields that I know. And here's another one. Now this one, I wonder if this is familiar to any of you. Because this one is a plant, again, of my childhood. I couldn't see it from a bedroom window, no, not big enough, but going onto the field where the Corn Marigolds were, this thing occurred as well. Very characteristic seed heads, which you can see in that picture, as well as the flowers. And you can see perhaps it does really genuinely look like a buttercup, and that's because it is one. It's the corn buttercup. Now the corn buttercup, it's a short-lived and annual, like all the others that I've mentioned so far, all been short-lived plants. And the corn buttercup, yes, it was once a very familiar cornfield weed, now not a familiar one at all. Again, I have to say, I took that picture in France, where many of these things are still commoner. It had a number of folk names, the one I like particularly being the Devil's Claw, and you can see why it's called that, because of the shape of its seed heads, rather unlike the common meadow and bulbous and creeping buttercups that we know and perhaps are more familiar with. But the corn buttercup has probably declined more than any other single cornfield weed. Look there at the number of dots that aren't blue. There's just a few dots. The corn buttercup is now a rare plant. It's not a big showy thing like a cornflower or even a corn cockle, but it is a very attractive plant in its own rather quiet way. And look at the decline there. It's just disappeared from its haunts. And as I say, this is a plant that I knew right next to as I was growing up. And it's one that I've seen it once, I think, in Britain in the last 10 years, and then the odd plant. I've seen it in France in a few places, but there, the disappearance of the corn buttercup. There's another picture of the corn buttercup, but what I want to draw your attention to there is you can see just to the left of that corn buttercup. I don't know how big the picture is going to come across to you, but just to the left of it, as we look at the picture, you can see a whole load of long, thin seed pods attached to a plant with some white flowers, which you can just about see just at the base of the corn buttercup plant. And this is another rather wonderful cornfield weed. It's a little bit commoner than the corn buttercup, but it still has declined very much. And this is the shepherd's needle, a rather unusual umbellifer, which has these very, very distinctive long fruits, the shepherd's needle of the name. And it occurs in just a few cornfields now, having declined really very seriously. You know, incidentally, you can see one or two others there. You can see there's a bit of mayweed towards the back. There's a plantain and one or two other things which I wasn't particularly going to talk about, but they're all there as cornfield weeds. And there's a bit of the common field speedwell, again, another one. There's, yes, a poppy again, keep getting into the pictures, doesn't it? You can see the much more spherical seed heads on that one, perhaps more clearly when I show you the long-headed one with its much longer seed head. But the blue flower that's next to the poppy, I'll show you a slightly closer up picture of it. I wonder if that one's familiar, because perhaps a bit less so. This one is the small bugloss, and it's again another cornfield weed that is very pretty. It's beautiful blue color, like the other buglosses and the alkanets and things, but a very attractive small flowered cornfield weed, which again has declined hugely across so much of our agricultural land. It's still present. There's the map of the small bugloss. Yes, it's still present. It's still present in all sorts of places. It's in a cornfield quite close to where I live now. I've seen him last year, but it's nowhere near as common as it used to be. And again, there's still an awful lot of pink dots and green dots and yellow dots there, which tell us where it's disappeared. Yes, there are still a lot of blue ones. Thank goodness for that. But it has declined really rather considerably. Here, a somewhat less common one and very distinctive one in its own way. Again, is this familiar? Do you know what it is? Because it's a plant which is perhaps not so familiar, and again a plant of my childhood, again a plant that I had in this farm field. And I don't think it was a particularly rich farm field. It just had a good collection of farmland weeds on it, cornfield weeds. This one is the beautifully named Venus's Looking Glass, a member of the bellflower family, which was, again, a fairly widespread cornfield weed, which is now not nearly so widespread as it was. Again, has declined, like all the others that I've been mentioning, has declined really rather seriously. I thought I'd put in this little quotation from George Crabbe's poem, The Village, which he wrote, as you see, in 1783, because it tells you something about some of these plants. Rank weeds that every art and care defy reign o'er the land and rob the blighted rye. Their thistles stretch their prickly arms afar, and to the ragged infant threaten war. Notice the war connection there. Their poppies, nodding, mock the hope of toil. There the blue bugloss paints the sterile soil. Hardy and high above the slender sheaf, the slimy mallow waves her silky leaf. Oh, the young shoot, the charlock, throws a shade, and the wild tare clings around the sickly blade. George Crabbe doesn't like these plants, does he? You know, he really wants to get rid of them. They're a nuisance. They're stopping the proper harvest, which he wants to do. He's a rather lugubrious kind of a poet anyway, old Crabbe. But he not only he doesn't like these plants because they get in the way of the harvest, but, and I think it's a big but here, he assumes you know what he's talking about. These are familiar plants. These are the ones that he knows, and that he expects people to know when people lived much closer to the agricultural land, to the soil where it was actually producing their food. So I think that, and this is what we've lost in many ways, is that familiarity with so many of these plants. So I'll just show you a couple more before we go, which probably aren't familiar because they are undoubtedly rarer. This one is believed to have gone completely extinct in this country. It may even be extinct again. A very distinctive little dandelion type inflorescence it has, but you'll notice quite a small one, and also these rather strange swollen stems underneath the flower heads. And I've got a slightly closer up picture of it there with this swollen stem underneath. This is the wonderfully named the swine's succory, the Arnoceris. And this plant, again, I took this in France. I'm afraid France does retain an awful lot more riches than we do in terms of its cornfield weeds, certainly south of Paris anyway. And that is the sad distribution of the swine's succory. There is one blue spot, and I think what was once Westmoreland, and otherwise you can, I don't know, they're a bit faint, aren't they? All they're mostly pre-1970. You can see the yellow dot is pre-1969 dots there, one or two since, but it was never a common plant. No, it wasn't a common plant, but it's declined to disappearance pretty well. And that one too. Now that's one I'd be, I would almost be surprised if anyone did know what that one is. That one is the Corn Cleavers. You can see the obvious resemblance to the cleavers, which is familiar to us all, which grows in almost every hedgerow, at least around here, a little bit of black grass at the back too. But the Corn Cleavers is a agricultural cornfield weed, and I was shown it once in the Rothamsted Experimental Station in Hertfordshire, and the person was saying, pointing it out, and he said, as far as he knows, this was in one of their experimental fields, which never had any herbicide treatment on it, and he said, as far as he knew, that was now the only place in the entire country where the corn cleavers actually still lived as a wild plant. So I've shown you some cornfield weeds, some of which will be familiar, but I suspect that most of them at least aren't familiar, and there were quite a number of others I could have shown. And the question then comes, do they matter? These are the plants that we've spent centuries trying to remove, trying to get rid of, because they're the plants that occupy the land that we want for our own purposes. And the other thing about them, of course, is that nearly all of them, if not quite all of them, were introduced into this country with the advent of agriculture back somewhere between, I don't know, 7,000 years ago and about 4,000 years ago, probably. Coming across, they come across with agricultural land, with cultivated, with arable land coming up with these cornfields. And they don't occur elsewhere. So it gives us this very peculiar position where you've got an ancient introduction, an Archaeophyte, introduced to places where we actually want to grow something else, and yet surely these were the familiar plants with the people. These are the plants we've got. They've got lots of the folk names associated with almost all of them. There are many ways that they're the plants that people used to know, to love. And yes, okay, but do you think, for instance, that even the poppy would have become the Remembrance Day symbol had it been as rare as it is now? It probably not. it became that because everybody was so familiar with it, and familiar with it in its great masses. So, but these other ones, these smaller, more sort of modest cornfield weeds, they're short-lived, and industrial agriculture, industrial food factories, which is what our agriculture has become, really have taken away these weeds almost completely. And I remember saying a most telling comment that when I made to some of my students a few years ago, when I made said, well, nobody really would walk for pleasure in most of the countryside anymore. And the student looked at me somewhat quizzically and said, but why not? And I said, because if you walk into, through, I said, if you walk through a wheat field or a rape field or a barley field or whatever, all you see is the crop. You don't see any plants at all. And she sort of looked shocked and she said, oh gosh, she said, but I don't consider that to be the countryside. I thought, oh my goodness. I do consider it to be the countryside. Okay, we're much more conscious of it now. We've managed to reintroduce these plants, or at least trying to leave them in some field margins, although there are still an awful lot of fields which don't have anything except the crop in them. And it's much better than nothing. It isn't quite the same, of course, as just being a weed, but they do occur in certain places. But I thought I'd perhaps leave the last word to Gerard Manley Hopkins in a poem from 1918. He said, what would the world be once bereft of wet and of wildness? Let them be left. Oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. Amen to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. That was a really, really interesting. Let me just get myself sorted here. Interesting and thought-provoking. Just to think about a picture of what's going on, and as you say, to be careful what you wish for. I was just wondering, you touched on a wee bit, with France, there's obviously still more, it seems to be more of those plants still to be found. Is that the case in Europe in general?
I'm quite familiar with parts of France. I absolutely love France, and I take my students there every year, and it's lovely country. The great thing about France is it's still really quite a rural country, and once you get south of Paris, you have to go south, a little bit south of Paris before. The northern part is just like the sterile fields of many parts of England. But once you get a little bit further south, it isn't. And there are patches, a lot of patches, which are slightly forgotten. Field edges, mostly field edges, it's true, but you do definitely feel there's simply a greater abundance of life. And I say many of the same species that we get here, the cornfield weeds, they are commoner. And many of them are much commoner. I have, seeing a field of cornflowers like that is still quite an unusual sight, but at least it does occur there. And in the more northerly parts of Europe, no, I think is the answer. But France does. And I think we've got to remember, France has roughly the same population as we've got here, but on a much larger habitable land area than we've got. So probably about 3 times the sort of easily habitable land than we've got, because yes, obviously it's got some mountains and things, but even on much of the Massif Central, which goes up quite high, it's still agricultural land. And it's just bigger. There's just more space. And I think that allows them to have retained more of these plants than we've done.
Yeah, just it reminded me, a friend's mum and dad live in sort of towards central south of France, and one of the reasons they live there is they said it reminds them of their childhood, the countryside around. It's exactly what you're saying about being familiar with all those plants. And
no, I feel the same too. Yeah, going down there and seeing, and you just think that there's a sense of that wonderful richness. Of of course I love this country as well, but you know, is it a shame that we've lost really quite a bit? And thank goodness. I mean, obviously, you know, we're getting much more aware of all this, and we're, you know, very much trying to save some of these places, and say it's far better to have these weeds just on the edges than not at all. But you know, we have lost quite a bit, and this is, I said, the cornfield weeds is a particularly interesting group. For all the reasons I said, because you know they're one. It's very difficult to know quite how best to conserve them because of the peculiar position that they're in.
Yeah, I was wondering that. I was wondering what is the future for conserving them? Is it places, you know, because they need disturbed soil, don't they, to sort of really sort of proliferate? Could it be like on verges and roundabouts and things like that? Do you think there's a place there, or?
I think the best first for them must be the edges of agricultural fields, I think. And I mean, just occasionally one of these plants does go wild. I mean, you do get poppy fields, like I showed at the beginning, just occasionally, and usually by mistake. I was alerted to an article in the Farmers Weekly about 2 years ago, where somebody was still thinking, oh, poppies, you know, dreadful scourge, you know, we must try and get rid of the poppies, and here's another new way of doing it, some, you know, new herbicide or something. And I just think, well, surely it's not that big a problem these days, to, you know, to have a few weeds, is it? I don't know. I'm obviously I'm not a farmer, but yeah, I mean, I think that the future of these weeds has to be in with friendly farmers and on the edges of their fields at least. I think I would go too. I think industrial farming has gone so far. There has been a move towards much more sort of broadly organic and its sort of associated features of farming, and there has been a move down there. I mean, I know a number of organic farms around here. It's still a small minority, but it's there and it is growing. And you know, the demand for organic food has certainly grown hugely in the last 30 years. So, and there, yes, they're not using herbicides. That's the whole thing. And so they are going to have to put up with some more weeds. And yeah, they're attractive to an outsider. They can be very attractive.
And I suppose it's thinking about the bigger picture of the value of the land and the landscape, and you know, bringing things like you know, leisure and cultural values. You know, when you think of the whole bigger picture, you know, we've got all those names, you know, like Viper's Bugloss and the what's the Shepherd's Needle and the Small Bugloss and Shepherd's Purse. All those names have got cultural kind of links, and you know, that's got a value too. I'm sure we're speaking to the converted here.
Yeah, I mean, you may know that the lovely book, Geoffrey Grigson's The Englishman's Flora, and he compiled. He lived in Somerset, and he compiled particularly folk names from the southwestern part of England, but he compiled them from elsewhere too. But the list of folk names for many of these plants is really quite long. You mentioned one or two of the lovely ones, and yes, they are. They're beautiful names, but it immediately shows the familiarity. It tells you that these were the plants that people knew and in many ways loved, even at the same time as they were trying to get rid of them. You know, but they do. They do inspire a lot of affection, and certainly these names. And of course, they also inspired some folklore. I mean, for instance, poppies are the best known of them all. You know, if you it's got association with thunderstorms. I'm going to get this slightly wrong as exactly what the association is, but I think if you harvest them, if you harvest something to do with the poppies before Midsummer's Day, then it means you're going to get thunderstorms to try and to ruin your crop. And if you do it on Midsummer's Day itself, It'll save you from thunderstorms. Very often these folklores, you've got the two opposites coming in depending on certain. I've got that one slightly wrong, but it doesn't matter. The point is that there's folklore associated with thunderstorms, with the poppies, so there are folk tales and folklore associated with quite a number of these plants. And yes, it's to do with the fact that they were familiar.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Lost Words project with Robert McFarlane and Jackie Morris. Perhaps there's something there to explore for somebody to do a similar thing with plants.
Well, yes, maybe so. As I said, I think Geoffrey Grigson did it many decades ago. I think published in the 1950s, I think, or early 60s, where he compiled the folk names as well as he could. And Richard Mabey has done something of the same with his Flora Britannica, published in 1996 or 7 or so, where he's tried to sort of compile the various folk tales and things about many plants. And I mean, that's a lovely book too. And of course, it has also inspired various other Britannica books have come up since then. It's inspired by Mabey's lead, and I think it's got some great stories in there.
Yeah. And it's just thinking it's fascinating to wonder. It's like the association with humans. What were those plants doing? How were they existing before agriculture? And it's just interesting to think about that.
It is interesting. It is possible that one or two of them have come from one or two naturally disturbed environments. Most obviously, sand dunes. Because there is a natural disturbance because you're being blown sand, and often they're growing. There were massive storms back in the medieval times, and most of our sand dune systems have been growing since then, but there's always disturbed soil there. There's always open spaces. Fundamentally, these plants just need lack of competition, for the most part. So one or two of them may have existed on somewhere like a sand dune, but the majority of them, there's no record before agriculture, and there's no pollen record or anything in the peat or whatever. And we're fairly sure they've come across, most of those ones I showed, if not all of them, have come across Europe with agriculture from the much more disturbed area in the Mediterranean. Some of them Western Mediterranean, some of them one or two parts of Eastern Europe rather than the Southeastern Mediterranean. But that seems to have been a particular place where they've come from, because that's also where agriculture came from. I mean, we know that. We know it's spread up initially from sort of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then sort of spread gradually through Southeast Europe and up northwestwards, and eventually, obviously, getting here.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's so interesting. So, so Andrew, just want to say thanks so much for giving your time to do that talk. It's I've just found it really, really interesting and thought-provoking as well. So, thanks so much. Hopefully people have been interacting in the chat section while the talk's been going on, and I think it lasts for just a couple of minutes once the premiere's finished, but people can still put comments in, and we would get back to them eventually.
I'm very happy to.
So that would be great, Andrew, if you could just keep an eye there. So so I just want to say thanks once again. We really appreciate you sharing all this information with us and giving this talk. It's been really, really great. Thank you.
That's a great pleasure. Look forward to some comments and questions.